Hello, I'm Stuart Pallister. After working as a journalist internationally for some 2 decades, mainly for CNBC in Asia, I switched to thought leadership and research communications in roles in higher education, working first for INSEAD Business School and then the National University of Singapore. Welcome to Leading Hospitality Through Turbulent Times. The series is entitled The World After 2020. This presentation will last about 1 hour with 30 minutes for questions. We'll take some after about half an hour and the remaining questions at the end of the session. We'll be taking written questions only, and you can submit these by using the chat function as we go along. And before we start, just a reminder that the session will be recorded and will be available on the Moodle platform afterwards. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Professor Yves Schemeil, who specializes in global and comparative politics, to take us through the next section of his presentation on the world after 2020, which today focuses on the World Health Organization, and he'll also be touching upon reducing uncertainty. Professor Schemeil.
Thank you very much, Stuart. I appreciate your great contribution to this invaluable contribution, actually, to the discussion we had last time, and I hope it will go as well this time. For sure. So this session is about the WHO and other international organizations that sometimes counterintuitively are involved in health issues, and this means that they are in a way influential in issues such as hospitality and mobility or tourism. But before we do this, let's just recap what we have learned so far. Well, we understand by now, I guess, or you do, that international organizations are very active in the field that are of some concern to you, and that they reacted to the pandemic rather quickly. They actually draw or try to draw lessons from the past and enact universal norms, which are more or less the paramount norms of sustainability and fairness. They also have made relevant statements relevant to the COVID crisis, proposed guidelines, which are, of course, very much welcomed by the hospitality business agents, by ordinary people, by air carrier, etc. And they started to collaborate with each other, or did collaborate more than they did in the past. And this, of course, empowered them, but they were much more empowered by the networks that they constituted during this crisis, even in the last few weeks. This will become much more obvious when we address the health sector itself and some of its extensions, which has much to do with health without being actually in the health sector properly. Let's start with the World Health Organization. We had a lot of questions about the WHO, of course, in previous sessions, and this time we're going to focus on it. The WHO has an initial mandate from the years it was established, which allows it to, for example, be in charge of vaccines and vaccination campaigns everywhere. So the whole world is supposed to vaccinate children, and there are phases or ages and campaigns of vaccinations, etc. And all this is actually set by the WHO. It can also decide on the quarantine if, for example, there is a source of infection somewhere. This was very helpful in the Ebola epidemic in Western Africa in particular. And it could have been very helpful for the current crisis, but there were some limitations that we're going to see in a couple of minutes. For the WHO, the existence of this institution matters less than the 2005 events, which in a way were a tipping point in history, because it was now entitled to proceed according to a number of regulations on which the states were now consensually agreeing, which are called the International Health Regulations. This is a document which is which has a legal capacity to be enforced by each state, not by the WHO itself, because the WHO is deprived of any special police by itself, but the state should make these international health regulations enforced. They should respect their whatever they recommend or they make compulsory. These new rules are focusing on detecting, assessing, and reporting threats. So detecting means that you should find a way to make any state in the world able to find out immediately or with little delay what's happening in terms of infection, and then report about this infection and the stage of this infection and dissemination speed to the WHO. It should also be able to assess whatever the danger are behind this threat. Is it a new threat? Is it a very threatening one, etc., or not? And then this is passed to the WHO, and the WHO collect the data, collect the reports, collect the informations, and make its own assessments. And then from this moment on, it can also make universal recommendations. The international health regulations are the basis on which inspections and controls can be actually launched by either the state or the WHO itself. So the WHO can send inspection groups to evaluate the situation on the ground and see how the states are reacting to this new threat. They could ask for justifications of the health policy adopted in such circumstances. And of course, they receive a lot of reports. You can imagine that with 193 states which are members of the World Health Organization, it's a lot of data processing that must. These reports, this inspection and this control, with the agreement, the new agreement called the International Health Regulations in 2005, become compulsory. So the states, which are the members of the WHO, cannot discard this obligation for local or contextual justifications. And this is being made public, which means that it's very difficult for any state to postpone for too long. They can postpone for a while, but it's very difficult to postpone for too long a time. The publicity given to the data collected and the dangerosity of the new virus, bacteria, or any other health problems. These regulations impose some behavior to national health authorities. There are specific procedures. The procedures are very important because, they format whatever the answer of the state to the questions raised by the WHO must be. And you cannot just send a note and very freely say whatever you want. I mean, there is a questionnaire. You have to tick boxes, and you have to answer questions each question before going to the next. And there are also consultation between states and between the WHO, which is compulsory, and of course reporting on any public health event, even if this event is apparently a minor one or disconnected from major waves of contamination. It also creates a permanent line of communication 24 hours a day. It looks like, the telephone that the Russians and the Americans used during the Cold War in order to avoid any unexpected nuclear war just by accident. So the Khrushchev and Kennedy actually decided on having this red line, hotline, which would help them to discuss in case of an unexpected emergency, which would actually be out of control of the two powers. And this also is the case with the WHO. I mean, apparently, when you look at this, you think that they are very much empowered and can do a lot of things. Whereas, of course, if states or governments are just dragging their feet before actually being compliant to these obligations, it takes time, and this time is of the essence in the matter of infections. These regulations gives the WHO some leverage anyhow, because the WHO can, of course, investigate. It can reach people who have other information than the official information which comes from the government, and they can request the national authorities to make a number of verification, because they have now the sources of information that are not completely congruent with the notes they receive from the local authorities or the national authorities of the state, and so they want them to check whatever is the truth. And these are actually very important powers, except that in the real world, these powers can be weakened by a number of constraints that weigh on the activities of the WHO. And if we are looking for the limitation of its powers, what we can see is that surveillance systems are good, well designed. Everyone is agreeing on the necessity to collect information in the same way, by the same type of tool, and send them in a format which is universal. And this absolutely just in time, not waiting too much in order to check whatever facts have been observed somewhere. And you must be very quick and react very reactive. But these surveillance systems can be affected by, for example, political considerations. No local authority want to have bad publicity, and we have seen this at Wuhan and the Hubei, because the local authorities there didn't want to show to the government in Beijing that they had big issues and that they could be responsible or held responsible for that. There are cultural factors as well, which cannot be neglected, because the beliefs, cultural beliefs, may be barriers to the fact that you actually understand exactly what's happening. For example, you may think that the threat is not as important for you, as severe as it is for other cultures, because of your religious beliefs. You're protected by your faith, or because your religious beliefs are conducive to not being vaccinated against this or that, and that is considered as being a good thing in case of a new pandemic for which there is no vaccine. There are ethnic considerations as well, and people who think that they won't be impacted by a new virus just because they are immune by birth, etc. There could be also economic necessity. I mean, for all those who have seen once or twice Jaws, you know that if there is a big danger, the problem is that you will lose tourism, and with it all the economic benefits from tourism, and that means that you may be very late in reacting to this kind of danger. In Jaws, it's a white shark, but in the current crisis of the COVID-19, it's a virus. So in that case, you will just be very late in making public, as you should do according to the regulations, the type of danger that we are facing and that we may all face in the long run if nothing is done at the local level. There is also the idea that if you are declared as a zone of possible contagion, then trade is going to be impacted. For example, there will be a ban on import from Hubei or from other countries which have been very much plagued by the virus. And so if this is the case, then of course there will be a lot of economic losses. But there is also another issue, which is that laboratories are, of course, populated by scientists who, on paper, are all committed to finding the truth and sharing their findings with other scholars and scientists worldwide. But actually, boundaries are national boundaries, and these laboratories are in a competitive world in which there are a possibility to get patents, which means profits out of a discovery, or because they have different cultures. And these laboratories, for example, are more or less oriented towards the empirical data, or more or less guided by theories, etc. This, for example, opposes in climate change the American labs to the European ones. It has been established by a number of publications, scholarly publications. The consensus of the experts, which is much needed in this particular type of situation, may be somewhat weakened by conflicts of interest. This is a well-known issue. People have to be had a very high reputation in their field, which means that there is a probability that the industry has already found them out somewhere and decided to propose them some funds to go and make their research. And that means that there can be some conflicts of interest with the pharmaceutical industry. And that would be very difficult to find very good scientists who have no connection at all with the industry, because otherwise they would probably lack the money needed to achieve their investigations. There are also methodological differences across countries. As I said, scientific cultures vary. And there can be local resistance to global investigation, as in Africa, for example, during the Ebola epidemic in Western Africa, because people thought that this was fighting the epidemic was the way the Western governments found to make a great comeback into Africa and interfere with the national authorities and in a way deprive them of their sovereignty. And also people were very much, they had distrust in their own government, and they didn't want to have to receive too many inspectors or people from the capital city in the area and territories on which they live, and which was plagued by the Ebola virus. The WHO also has a limited influence on tourism. I mean, if we just try to find out whatever can be the interests of the WHO in this sector, there are very few things actually. But the interesting point about that is that the individual responsibility is the focus of the interest of the WHO. That means that there are hazards, medical hazards as well, and accidents. But in the case of the WHO, it's about disease, and of course you can help and support the national health authorities in order to make them able to actually implement the regulations, the best regulations possible, in order to avoid people nasty things when they travel. But the point is that it's an individual responsibility. I mean, you should yourself, when you travel, when you just plan to travel, you should think of any unpredictable things that could happen to you, and you should be prepared for that. And you should pay for an insurance system, for example. You should just learn about the type of threats and risks to which you will be confronted during the trip and once at destination, etc. So, as it is said here, people planning to travel should seek advice on the potential hazards in their chosen destination. So it's your responsibility to do this. If you don't, it's like ignoring the law. Nobody is supposed to ignore the law. You should know it. If you don't, it's your responsibility. And the remaining paragraph is also very telling. Although the medical profession and the travel industry can provide extensive health and sound advice, it remains the traveler's responsibility to seek information, to understand the risk, because if you understand the risk, you take the necessary precautions. If you don't understand the risk, then you are actually guilty of whatever will happen to you. So it's not properly what would be the expectations about an international organization for which the health concerns when people travel and go there for anywhere for fun would be actually a priority. It is not yet a priority. Possibly it can become a priority in the next future. But these limitations of the power of the WHO can be, in a way, balanced by a number of things. First, there is a transnational medical culture. I mean, people know that other physicians elsewhere or specialists are working on finding vaccines or better understanding the DNA and the RNA of a virus, for example, new virus, for example, etc. So they mean that, I mean, you don't much debate about what medicine is about. I mean, there are people who are split by different theories in physics and even in the social, and of course in social sciences, but not too much in medicine. Medical culture is overwhelming everywhere for people who are physicians and who are researchers in the field of biology, etc. So the main problem for people who are in medicine is to overcome the specialties in which they are involved by now after years of learning, because if you look at the COVID-19, I mean, the number of people who intervene and who make public their own assessments of what's happening and what we should do about that are specialists of infectious diseases, of epidemics, virology, emergency care, anesthesia, microbiology, animal diseases, and a number of others. I mean, it's a long list of specialties, and these people have to get along together and not trying to make their own specialty prevail over the other, which of course is really demanding for some of them, especially when some of their peers are just dying from a pandemic. So this being said, when they accept to work together, then they share their findings. Well, then they share their findings. It's not so simple, because they can try to work together and then find out that working together is a little difficult, that it requires long delays, that you have to accommodate people whom you think not as competent as you are, and you also may have doubts about the relationship between these people and their own government, or the fact that they can deprive you of, for example, being awarded a Nobel Prize, a medicine Nobel Prize, because of your own advances in the research, etc., etc. So, yes, that's on paper. You share your findings. You pay lip service to the cause that sharing the findings of those who make research on coronavirus, for example, is important. But it does not happen as often as it should, according to the number of crises we are facing. So another type of compensation, which is the increased cooperation, and this is probably the most important aspect of how to expand the powers of the WHO. First, there are health institutions like the WHO and others, which collaborate with non-health intergovernmental organizations. I'll give you an example. The IAEA. The IAEA work with the WHO on particular specific diseases like the ZC disease, but they are also trying to find answers, ways to identify some problems with the help of radioisotopes. And at the same point, there are people, and physicians in particular, who are very well organized in big NGOs and who fight publicly the IAEA on the ground that nuclear materials are dangerous per se, and that even in hospitals they have to be manipulated with care, and that there's a source of danger, and that nuclear wastes are going to poison future generations and whatsoever. So you see, the problem is that the health institutions may be simultaneously very helpful in fighting against diseases, and at the same time, these non-health institutions which are involved in health can also be for the health of some people in the world or the future generations. But there are also NGOs, and cooperation with NGOs is actually an increasing business because in the end, as I previously said, you come and have networks, and networks are a way to be empowered. I give you an idea of the extension of these international organizations, which consider themselves as being the custodians of our health. And without them, we should be at risk. So they deliver this global public good, which is health. There is the World Health Organization, of course, but there is also the World Organization for Animal Health, because it is connected to the WHO through the fact that the diseases are passed to humans by animals, like bats, like others, like porks, like chickens, ducks, and so on. There are questions?
Not at the moment, no.
Okay. Okay.
So if anyone would like to send over a question via the chat, we'll pass it on.
Okay. The Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, which was established in 2002, is also part of this network, like UNAIDS, which is another way to look at the same type of issues, a global polio eradication initiative, rollback malaria, and whatsoever. The Clinton Global Initiative is about that, and Bill and Melinda Gates followed suit. And there is also a very important, prominent actor, which is the International Federation of the Red Cross, the ICRC, which is in Geneva, quasi non-governmental organization, but at the same time recognized as an equal by the governments and allowed to operate on the field, in particular when there is such difficulties as a war, spots where terrorism plague the normal life of people, and places where there is an impact of epidemic. So it's a large network, but there are other organizations as well. This is just an example of a number of organizations which are very much involved in the field and committed to find solutions in common. There are also other international organizations which are indirectly involved in the health sector. They are not actually, they were not established to deal with health, but they do have some influence on health issues. UNICEF, because they want to prevent child labor, they want to avoid sex offenses, and this, of course, has a lot of consequences on the health condition of a lot of people everywhere. If you look at genital mutilations, for example, you can understand my point. UNDC, which is the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, because they fight trafficking in humans, like refugees, for example, but also women who think that they will live very poor condition in somewhere in Southern Europe, and They have the ambition to become top models, for example, or play in movies, and then they end up in being prostitutes and child sex tourism whatsoever. So that's the mandate received by UNODC from the United Nations. There is also the International Organization for Migration, because they want to help people to migrate decently and be resettled in an acceptable way when they return home, which of course is completely torn down by the waves of refugees in which you find a number of economic migrants. There is also the UNHCR, which is dedicated to refugees, but also displaced people within the country and not across boundaries, asylum seekers, and now latest mandate that the UNHCR actually self-claimed, you patriots, whatever. So
if I could jump in with one or two questions while we're waiting for other questions to come via chat. First of all, you mentioned about the new health regulations. Why 2005 was the tipping point? Was that because of SARS?
No, I guess when you have a resolution, worldwide implemented resolution like this one, it took years before you reach the point where you can vote on that resolution or just adopt this resolution, even without a vote on the basis of a consensus. So it just possibly the 2003, 2005 episodes just accelerated the pace of reaching a consensus on the final drafts. But let me give you an example. You know that when you have a resolution like this one, the comma matter. The commas, because I mean it's about the vocabulary used. It's also about the priorities, what is put at the top, what is put in the middle and at the bottom, etc. And each paragraph is debated for years. So when you have 193 writers, potential writers, which have national interests, which may diverge, what happens is that the staff of the WHO, for example, write down a provisional draft, and in this draft there are a number of brackets. Brackets means that this is the proposal of the staff, not yet discussed by the World General Health Assembly, for example, and of course the executive committee of the WHO, and these brackets have to be waived. The problem is that it takes a long time to waive all the brackets in the text. And when there are no longer any more brackets, at that point, it becomes consensus. So you cannot imagine that any event can do anything else but accelerating the final manipulation of the text in order translation, official translation whatsoever. And so you also have to endorse the translation and so on. So in the end, it can be made public, and it also has sometimes to be ratified, which is not the case of these regulations, because they are regulations, not a treaty. If it were a treaty, you should also wait until it would be ratified by national parliaments, for example, and 193 national parliaments, that makes quite a lot. So in that case, I guess it has no particular relations with what happened on the ground.
Well, we've seen the World Health Organization coming in for a lot of criticism during this crisis, especially from Donald Trump in the US. And he's basically saying he's going to be cutting the funding. But the World Health Organization seems to be already drastically underfunded for what it does. And some people are saying it should be focusing on potential pandemics rather than the whole panoply of diseases that it's also looking at, whether it's malaria or tuberculosis or whatever.
Well, there's already a division of labor between the WHO and other organizations. In a way, you can consider the fact that there is the Global Fund for these particular diseases and UNAIDS um, as a proof that the distrust in a global health organization in the United States, independently of who is in power, because this happened during the Obama mandate as well. This already happened. This was already the case a long time ago, and you know, because if you give a mandate to the WHO to care for pandemic, and at the same time you give the money to a fund which is addressing the main pandemics to which we were confronted in the past decades, that means that you divide and rule. And this was done on purpose by the US government. So so it's a long story. Second, I mean, you never forget that the means or the funding which accrue to any international organization should be consolidated. First, you have this budget, of course, which is too poor on paper to face this type of pandemic alone. But you also have the headquarters and the maintenance and everything which is related, any expense which is related to the headquarters in Geneva, and that's paid for by the Swiss government. You have the physicians and all experts who are representative of their governments, or and then they are, as experts, they are salaried by their national governments. So that makes a lot of money in the end. And so they might also be invited by people to travel and see on the ground things that the local governments want them to see, and so on. So it's the aggregated ultimate final budget would be much higher than what you can see on paper. And also, most of the time, they have the possibility to receive conditional funding, funds which accrue to them to care for special disease, for example. And from time to time, it can be a large amount of money. And finally, they just say what's the common the consensual knowledge is conventional, or knowledge is among scientists about viruses, bacteria, pandemic, epidemics, etc. It's not that they cure people themselves. They don't. So they don't need as much money as hospitals do in a country like Germany or Switzerland or Italy. They just need to enough money at the International Panel on Climate Change just to meet somewhere and to make assessments. And so making assessments means sometimes traveling on the spot and inspecting the ground as well. But it doesn't mean that you have to mobilize large means to cure people and buy medicines, drugs, whatsoever.
We have one question on the live event.
No, hold on. Just 1 second. I mean, about political consideration. I mean, you know that the main critic, just for the sake of making sure that everyone is on the same line. We are not out of sync about that. I mean, Trump criticized the WHO because he thought that the WHO was actually under the control of the Chinese government. And so it's true that they have a Chinese, they had a Chinese head of the WHO, Margaret Chan. It's true that they tried to get a number of access to a number of heads of the other international organizations at the same time. And it's true that health matters a lot for them, especially in Africa, etc. But that's also a very old story. I mean, this type of suspicion has always been actually emitted by governments, by journalists, by the media, etc. I mean, you may find ground to criticize the WHO for siding with one government against the others. There will be some proof of that, but in the end, you know, they do whatever they can. I mean, they are physicians. They are committed to neutrality in a way. That's all. Okay, sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah,
But
no, sorry, no, I didn't realise you were going to continue. But I mean, from my point of view, Margaret Chan is somebody from Hong Kong, and I'm not sure it would be right to classify her as a Chinese stooge. But
anyway, I can tell you, because I met her, that she was not just a servant of the Chinese mainland government.
Fine. So maybe if you'd like to take the question that we have on the Q&A
Okay.
before moving on. And it's whether the WHO acted a bit late, bit too late regarding this crisis, or was it the countries themselves? And couldn't the WHO have requested that all the countries quarantine travelers?
Well, they could, of course. The problem is to have the undebatable facts to oppose to those governments which would not like to organize a quarantine. So the problem for the WHO is like when you have a prosecution in the court. I mean, you can raise issues, and for example, there is now this very example of some people in some countries are going to sue local authorities, health authorities, even the head of their government, because of the way they actually mismanaged the current crisis. And people died around them, for example, fathers or husbands or whatsoever. And so the problem is that, according to lawyers, this will go nowhere, because there won't be proof that intentionally, on purpose, the people attacked, prosecuted, were actually manipulating reality and did things which were very nasty on purpose, intentionally, etc. So you don't have the proofs. So in a way, if you cannot bring proofs to the governments that they should imperatively organize the quarantine now, then even if you have the right to demand this, your demand is not going to reach the ears of the legitimate and legal authorities. And so you will not reach a synchronized quarantine. And by the way, as you know, the waves was actually impacting countries one after the other and not simultaneously. So organizing quarantines would require for the WHO to have some sort of an assessment or a scale, and saying that once you are at this stage, then you should organize the quarantines, no discussion. So, but they were not able to elaborate this, because this is an unknown virus, and because it takes time, especially when you're a scientist, to reach that point where you can be quite sure of your recommendation to the states. Well, for an example, you can just look at what happened in climate change. It took decades before the IPCC was able to say, if we have to remain behind 1.5 rise of the global warming in the years to come, and before, for example, 2030 or 2050. And then if we don't do this and that at that point of time, now or in 2 years or in 3 years, then. And so in a way, it follows, I mean, the implementation of the recommendations follow automatically, but it took decades, and it's about climate change, which will impact the future generations, not the people who are living now. So you can imagine with such a contagion, such a pandemic, that it is still more difficult.
Right, fine. That's all the questions we have at the moment.
Okay.
So we'll come back to more questions at the end of the session.
Thank you, Stuart.
Thanks.
Okay, so there are other IOs which are directly involved in the health sector, as I said, and we have an example, very a recent example yesterday, where this organization, UNODC, UNAIDS, and the UNHCR had a joint statement on COVID-19 and its impact on prisoners. And so I let you read this when you want, but the important thing is that they say that they are leaders in global health, human rights and development institutions, and that come together if you really want to prevent the dissemination of a virus. They act together because there are people who are vulnerable, and so the idea is that, you know, as a norm, as a universal norm, where someone is vulnerable, you have to come and rescue the vulnerable people in priority. And so this is the rationale behind this statement, yesterday's statement, which in my view is rather important because it shows that health issues are actually addressed by organizations which, if you read carefully the status and the mandate, are not expected to operate, be active in this field. So now let's turn to something which is probably of more concern to most of you, which is the relationship between health, mobility, and tourism. Well, we have lists like this, but we could also draw quite a number of other lists with other organizations, and we will just observe after a while that there is a lot of overlap between these organizations on issues which impact people who are in the hospitality business. There are in particular organizations which focus on tourism and make norms to facilitate tourism, are those which enact norms that in the end can just hamper tourism because it will be too much difficult, for example, to live on touristic activity when there are too many regulations which prevent tourists to visit sites, historical sites, or natural sites, etc. So the question is, the UN is the leading organization in promoting what it's called the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals, and which are the goals of the decades, possibly the century. So if you want to help the global south to catch up with the pace of economic growth and social change and political improvements of the global north, which is actually a priority of the UN, then you should try to endorse this SDG and make things consistent. Whatever decision you make, it should be consistent with the SDGs. So the question is tourism compatible with the SDG? There are reasons to ask this question, because of course you can, for example, attract tourists with the help of cultural landmarks, and UNESCO with the World Heritage did a lot to make some landmarks more attractive than others, and so there is now a competition between countries to have their landmarks put on the list of the World Heritage of UNESCO. But in national Ministry of Cultures, there have been achievements such as national treasures in Japan. National treasures can be a person, not only a landmark or a place. Heritage sites in the UK, and in France we have a very well-established cultural policy, which spots from time to time new heritage sites without calling them with the same terms. But we also have organizations which have a mandate to protect nature against tourism. For example, UNEP. UNEP is the United Nations Environment Program. Well, tourism is a source of pollution because of the kerosene used by planes, or because of the fuel wasted by ships, because of the waste that tourists leave, whatever the recommendations of the travel agencies are on the ground after visiting a spot somewhere. and also just because moving one bus or coach of tourists to a place is a source of pollution, and because preparing meals for them according to international standards makes possibly locals producing more waste for tourists than for ordinary customers, etc. You also have the UNFCCC, it's about the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which encouraged the IPCC and the World Meteorological Organization to improve their knowledge and multiply their recommendations about how to fight climate change. Well, in that case, of course, again, you have impact on flights, impact of any type of trips, and also there are countries in which there are too many visitors, possibly, and take an airport like Charles de Gaulle in Paris, and another one like Frankfurt in Germany, or London, Heathrow. I mean, these airports are considerable sources of pollution and attempt at the warming, a way to increase the global warming effect. There are also the Convention on Endangered Species, because if you travel to Africa to observe animals, it might be plaguing or putting at risk the life and the lifestyles, if I can say so, of a number of species. Not to say that some are, of course, threatened by poachers and by smugglers, and then by people who do illegal trade with some part of dead animals, which are killed just for that, etc. But you can also endanger species just because you live there. I mean, we have now the proof that scientists are right when they say that we are impacting on the life of every animal, because due to the lockdown, a number of them are coming back in the neighborhoods. We can see them in the street, and we can hear them, and as birds, for example, sing more than ever, etc., etc. So because of this, tourism is connected to tourism positively as a way to attract them, and negatively as a source of problems that should be solved. So all these organizations that I have mentioned have one common characteristic: they make norms. We have seen this many times until now. International organizations are about norms. New norms may be a source of difficulty in the hospitality industry, because it's difficult to adapt to these norms and respect them. For example, distantiation is going to be quite difficult to organize in small restaurants, which are places that people find very attractive, and bistro style, or all these small food trucks or whatsoever they can find everywhere in the world, but also on planes, etc. But there are also norms which are related to hygiene, for example, norms which are ruling the type of behavior that should adopt towards the locals, and so on, which sometimes makes the lives of travel agencies, travel agents, difficult. And there are new norms every year, so each time you have to look for the innovations and find out ways to adjust to these innovations in your own business. But there are also international norms which are paramount norms, which exist everywhere and now for a long time, like naming and shaming norm. That means that you use a norm which helps you to denounce the behavior of some people or a country, or a government, actually, and ask for other people to infer that it should be shamed for that behavior. Shame on you, because you did this or you didn't do this. And so that's a source of conformism, and everyone everywhere is expected to abide by these social rules or uses, which may not be yet or may not become ever rules, legal rules, but are considered as very constraining by the agents themselves. And so if it is not a rule, it's a benchmark. And so if you don't respect the benchmark, I mean, the question will be why? And there are people who will ask for this type of discrepancy between your own policy and the policy which should be adopted or are allegedly adopted elsewhere. And there also are moral norms, which matter much more than you might expect. For example, toleration of the social, ethnic, linguistic, whatsoever differences, tourist agents and hotel managers and people who have restaurants and careers, etc., airlines. All these people should organize this sort of toleration. For example, you should, in a way, find procedures to accommodate people who are overweight and are handicapped in a way or another. You should also organize something which is called in the scholarly literature recognition. You can use it as between quotation marks. Between recognition means that you fully accept the difference and you like it in a way. You like that people are not exactly like you, and that they have good ground to differ from you on a number of aspects, even sometimes in moral beliefs, but because you think that they are respectful, you accept them as they are, as a whole, and so you recognize them as your equal. That's very important, that they are your equal. So if you have to make every type of people who travel somewhere able to abide by this recognition norm, then in the end, it's tough work because there are a number of people who spontaneously do not do this and sometimes do exactly the contrary. Take the social norms of civility. Civility is very interesting because it's both about distinction. I mean, if someone is well educated, then he or she is a civil person. I mean, the more educated you are and the more civil you are. It's also a matter of distantiation, so you don't come too close to people, or you don't shout at them from close, short distance, and you should not do this with too much ostentation as well, which is in a way contradictory. These are examples taken in England on the one hand and Japan on the other hand, which show what I have in mind. Social norms, the social norm of civility is probably one of the most interesting ones. It's an art to behave in public and has been more or less actually thought out during the 18th century. People must tame their passions, have self-control, learn not to harm anyone. They should learn politeness, table manners. There are also ways to speak. There are things that you can say, others they cannot. And urbanity, which means being able to live in densely populated area with people and according to the manners that you learn in a city. So city, civil, civility, whatsoever. So being civil is to become civilized. This comes mainly from one of a very interesting book, and I tried to show it to you if I can. Yes, see, this is Case Thomas, In Search of Civility. Very interesting and very thick books, by the way, in which you will find quite a number of quotations, which if I had time, I could read to you, but I'm short of time for the moment. Let's see what will come out when I reach the end. And so that means that if you are civil, you are civilized, and then you can be a citizen. And citizens are civic. So it's a whole connection of behaviors that make living together possible in society, in a polity, and in the world. Because if you are civilized and behave according to your civility in your own country, then it's expected that you do the same with people who are strangers and foreigners. With this, you can avoid war, or you can just put an end to wars and go towards, move towards a more civilized world, which means a more peaceful one. So that's a very interesting norm, which is universal. You find it everywhere, and people know exactly what are the appropriate ways to behave in public with other people, not to harm them, and that's something which is appreciated because you can find it everywhere. Now, there are political norms as well. The problem with political norms is that you have one norm and you have the opposite. This is why I said it's between the devil and the deep blue sea. We are between two contradictions, by the way. So, for example, are we going to privilege efficiency, a government which is very effective in having a policy adapted to, for example, an economic crisis? Or should we look for fairness? And we are going to be very careful not to leave anyone alone on the sidelines of the policy adopted. Shall we opt for free markets, on which it's a competition and it's a wild competition, whatever happened then to the losers, or should we adopt labor laws which will protect the losers against the winners? Should we opt for free trade or for fair trade? I mean, this is something that I already addressed, so I'm not going to go in depth, and you can just go and look for the records. Equity. Shall we privilege merit, or shall we look for equality? And then justice may just unfold from the fact that we are very sensitive to the fact that we treat people equally everywhere, whatever they are, whoever they are, wherever they come from. Should we also insist on responsibility? So in that case, I mean, self-help is the rule. I mean, if you, for example, you pay for the health insurance, then you get health care. But if you don't, you just die. That's your problem, and that's what probably some head of states are thinking about the coronavirus disease pandemic. Or are we stressing solidarity, which means that we want a state of welfare for people who live in our state? Another norm which is very interesting is electoral integrity and participation to decisions which concern you, or just giving people the formal right to express their view, like, for example, casting a vote in the polls. And that will be the only concern. If people vote, whatever the difficulties they may face to make their opinion conveyed to the people who would be elected, and also to elect the people they want to be elected, it doesn't matter. Well, those people, or those scholars who insist on electoral integrity, saying this is a process in which, you know, from the very beginning, are people who are in the opposition able to make their opinions plain in the media long enough before the voting day, allowed to and immune for are they're considered immune for the whatever they say on the waves and on the media, in the newspaper, and are people prevented to go to the polls? Like, for example, you organize a traffic jam, and so the people who are expected to arrive at a certain time during the day cannot reach the polling station. Are the people who moderate or just organize a surveillance, monitor the whole process? Are they neutral? Are they completely dependent on the government? Are they also just representatives or proxies for the opposition or whatsoever? So all this makes electoral integrity an important norm. So if you just have the electoral participation norm, which was the case for decades, then every country should organize elections. Now, what happened during the electoral process was no more not the source of concern. You just wanted, from the UN point of view, countries ought to organize elections. Now, if you want to have electoral integrity, that's another story. You need to include everyone into the process. So it's about inclusiveness. You don't want to exclude people just because they don't know how to write, they are illiterate, just because they live too far away from polling stations, just because they don't have enough guarantees that they won't be you won't suffer from retaliation because they go to the polls in places where the oligarchy, for example, has militias and then security guards and watch over whatever happens in their territory, and so on and so forth. So if you want to be inclusive, you're of course promoting universal suffrage, and this is exactly what at the level of the world you have with the United Nations General Assembly, where every country is represented, and it's one country, one vote. And just near the just facing it, you have the G7. The G7, where the 7 richest countries of the world in this club of decision makers make important decisions or make important commitments to rule the world according to their own rules, and so that of course limited suffrage. At least there are very few people who can express their views. It's exclusive and not inclusive. So an inclusive political norm would be, for example, like here in Mali, where you have elections, but that's not enough. Then you have whole teams of people paid by the United Nations, trained by the UN, in order to guarantee that in the end the elections were free, neutral, independent from the government, and the opposition had its chances, equal chances, equal opportunities to. Now, what is the impact of political norm on tourism? Well, it's important to be inclusive. So important that the head of the UN World Tourism Organization, Politikashvili, Georgian, recently said this: governments have an opportunity to recognize tourism unique. Opportunity is the COVID crisis, by the way. Tourism unique ability to not only provide employment, well, that's because of the economic recession in the offing, etc. Well, employment matters, of course. That's an argument to bring to the state in order to make them rescue the tourist industry home. To not only provide employment, to drive equality and inclusivity. Tourism is the activity which will be responsible, or people who are the operators of this field will be responsible for more equality and more inclusivity of all people in the benefit of whatever can be expected from growth, from social change, from the capability to enjoy life and nature and city and landmarks and whatsoever. So it's not fun, but it's in a way very interesting and telling to see that even if you are in charge of an organization which address tourist issues at a time of a big crisis, which is a big danger for this industry, then you say we are also responsible, the ultimate responsible, in a way, of the biggest norm that we can imagine at the time, which are equality and inclusivity. But there are also economic norms, and these economic norms also have an impact on the hospitality business, as we shall see in a minute. And sorry for being late, but we also have a break for discussion. I managed to have time for discussions too in a couple of minutes. So in finance, commerce and the economy, normal standard exists from the end of World War II. There are a number of institutions that are famous, which are of that. One which is less famous and very important is the Bank for International Settlements, which is the international central bank of the national central banks. So central banks depend on the BIS in order to wage their activities smoothly, and if they are threatened by the risk of having a shortage in liquidity, for example, etc. I mean, they depend on the Bank for International Settlements, which has its own regulation, is a very important one, rich and powerful, and that, of course, a lot of people do not know, and we don't even imagine that it exists, and it exists for such a long time. There is also the European Central Bank, that probably much more famous, at least in Europe, which is itself a source of quantitative easing policies as the Fed administration in the United States, which means massively buying public debt and bonds and public bonds when needed, and of course drowning the markets with additional liquidity, which prevent recessions. They have two current programs, one which is called the PSPP, the Public Sector Purchase Program. It's a very, very huge program, as you can see. And the other one, which is specific to the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program. Now, everyone can understand that we need a special program in case of such an aggression against mankind, which comes from this unknown virus. But this is, of course, an addition to what already exists due to the 2008 crisis, which was a purely economic crisis. So in the end, we have two programs, one which is linked to a past crisis and the other one which is just nation. And the problem is that probably it can overstretch the perimeter of activity of the central bank, and there might be people who are critical of that. And so the problem is that, you know, you need enough liquidity thanks to the business operators, but you are not absolutely sure that this liquidity will accrue to you. Why? Because, for example, this public sector program of the European Central Bank has been criticized some days ago by the German Constitutional Court. The basis of the contest was that if you add up the PPSP and the PSPP, then in the end, what you have is something like more than a third of the German debt that will be bought by the Central European Bank. And that is for the German constitutional justices, like helicopter money. You know, you take off on a helicopter and you just drown people on the ground with banknotes. And so this was the basis of this critic. In a way, and the same way the IMF can also give countries a lot of liquidity in case of need, but it's in time of crisis, and it's not sure that countries, like for example, by now Lebanon, would be able to repay the IMF for that, and so the IMF stakeholders can be very reluctant to lend too much money to a country which needs a lot of money at some point. But there also are economic norms which pertain to hospitality. And these norms are norms which can help people in the hospitality business to forecast what the global economic context will be in the years to come. You can just figure out that because these people have a responsibility at the IMF level or the World Bank or the European Central Bank, etc., they have responsibilities exactly to do this, forecast the future years or decades. Then they will help you to better understand what is expected or what is likely and make your own assessment and then your own decisions. But that's not sure because the IOs actually rely on contradictory norms. The norms of fairness, for example, as I said, and the norm of efficiency are completely opposed to each other. But I give you other examples of that. If you focus on purely management types of norms, then you are cost killers. You don't want surpluses. You are fighting over capacity. You don't want strategic stocks because these stocks are very costly and probably won't be helpful at any point. But you will need them in case of shortage or in terms of lockdown, for example. And there are also the question of renewal of your strategic stocks of, for example, protective wear in case of a pandemic. The fact that there are two series of norms, once you should kill costs and be just on time, and the other, and the market is, of course, the driver of your decisions. And the other, which is we should be worrying about the future and the future generations and the welfare of people who are vulnerable now and who could be vulnerable in the future if we don't act accordingly. So that is a rule, the opposition, the paramount opposition between two types of ideologies, the liberal family and the social family. And the important thing here is that the future of the world can be determined by their confrontation in their countries, national countries, but also within the international organization in which they operate. For example, the Trump administration doesn't do exactly the same as the Obama administration, because the Trump is more oriented toward the liberal goals, and Obama was more oriented towards the social goals. And that's something which becomes visible at the level of international organizations. So if we want to sum up before the last questions, IOs can pool knowledge and resources and make them available worldwide. And that, of course, is a very good thing for health. They guarantee the provision of money and the availability of loans. That's good for mobility. And they build some predictability, making economic agents able to discount the future, which is good for tourism. But the good functioning and smooth functioning of all this will depend on the resilience of diplomacy and democracy at world level in a turbulent context. Will diplomacy and will democracy be affected by the series of viruses which are each time very damaging for the economy and for the lives of human beings and also for the social life? That's a big question. And so this will be the next question that we'll raise next week. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. We've got about 10 minutes for questions, if anybody would like to send some over. We've got one question pending. But before that, maybe if I could just follow up on something you said earlier about the new norms. The World Health Organization has issued health guidelines which cover hospitality, cover restaurants, cover hotels in terms of the sort of health regulations and so on, or health standards they should be aiming for. But obviously they don't have any sort of enforcement. How do you regard this in terms of the way WHO has looked into this? Has approached it?
Well, just think of the difficulty in which you would be as the permanent representative of a country to the WHO if you, on the one hand, vote for such recommendation, saying that in restaurants, for example, this is type of precautionary process that you should adopt, and then you come back home and you are not able to make these recommendations enforced by your own authorities, which are the one who paid you, sent you, and instructed you to vote for this recommendation. So this contradiction cannot hold for long. It should be solved in a way. And so it's not only about naming and shaming, it's the fact that you have a divided self. You are a member of the WHO when you are the headquarters in Geneva, and you opt for some recommendation and you endorse this and you have instructions to do it. Then you come back home and you are now back to your national health institution authority, and then you have to persuade the same people who sent you to Geneva to enforce this commitment. So the only thing is that it can take time. So the time lag to make the commitment enforced can be longer than if it would be delegated completely to the WHO with the police force to make the recommendation enforced without delay. So it's a problem of time lag, I guess, because you have to return to home, you have to observe that people don't exactly adopt the recommendations made by the WHO, and so at some point you are, in a way, you may be worrying. I voted for something and I'm not even able to make it implemented in front of my very eyes. So there is something which goes wrong, and that works everywhere.
But how effective do you think the WHO is?
Well,
as an organization,
it's the source of conventional wisdom about diseases, whatever the disease is, and a number of diseases are now plaguing not only the economy, social life, and human life, but more and more, I mean, increasingly plaguing us. So they are more and more important because they are the only source of an agreement about what type of dangers we are facing. It's like, the International Panel on Climate Change. You don't need much money. You don't need even not such a long history as the WHO has. You just have to warn people and say, well, all the experts that we can invite for discussions at that level are all agreeing by now. They didn't agree in the past, now agree on this. So that's, conventional wisdom. What you can do about that? I mean, nobody would say from one country. I mean, so for example, someone responsible for the sanitary regulations in his country or her country, and come and take the microphone and say, well, I don't agree with whatever the WHO says and whatever the others do, because it's not, you cannot hold that position for long.
But it seems that things could have been a lot better if there'd been greater cooperation between countries, and really it's only through the World Health Organization you could do that. We've seen Asian countries, South Korea, Taiwan was an island, but Taiwan, Hong Kong's been very effective. Singapore was very effective up until the recent outbreak among the foreign migrant dormitories. They could have learned to other countries in Europe and in America, in North America, South America, could have learned a lot of lessons from the way Asian countries had approached this. And they had already learned lessons from dealing with SARS previously, and H1N1, MERS, and whatever.
Okay. Joker, because this is going to be addressed in the next session. Exactly.
Right.
all this. So it's a very relevant question and comment, good. But I have answers which I can unfold in depth with time next time we meet.
Okay, so perhaps we'll go to the live Q&A question. It was a follow-up to the previous question that was asked about whether the WHO had acted too late, and shouldn't it have requested that all countries go into effectively implement quarantine. And the follow-up question is, maybe there is no proof, as you were outlining, and that countries didn't act in a simultaneous way, because with no quarantine from the beginning. But if there had been quarantine, wouldn't the number of cases been far, far limited?
Well, first, you should not forget about the quarantine, that the countries which succeeded in fighting the coronavirus had no quarantine from the very beginning. Taiwan had no quarantine. Singapore had no quarantine. South Korea and Japan.
But
they had absolutely no lockdown.
Well, they did do self-isolation, and they did do tracking and tracing.
Well, they trace people, and that's another issue, which is, would you accept in your own country to be traced that way, and what are your legal protections, and so let me give you just one example of the time it takes to reach a consensus about anything, even if it's an emergency. In 1962, there was this Cuban missile crisis, and the world was on the verge of disappearing because of nuclear war between the United States and the USSR, which had launchers of ballistic missiles wearing nuclear heads in Cuba. So the Americans suspected that something of the kind was happening in front of them, but they had no proof. So they wanted to collect the proof and go to the UN Security Council and ask for a withdrawal of the US experts from Cuba. And so in their quest for proofs, they had one vector of collecting facts, which was their CIA agents in Cuba. So one of them photographed a cargo ship, a number of men only, landed in Santiago harbor. They wore nice flower suits, Hawaiian suit, etc. And they boarded some sort of military type of lorries, and obviously they were behaving as soldiers. So he took the picture and sent them to Washington, to Langley. How long it took to check that everything was okay, this was not a source of disinformation, that is 2 months. And you know, we were on the verge of a nuclear war. We could have disappeared. You and me, we won't be here, and neither would be all those who are listening to us by now. So you see, it takes time to check. It takes time to make sure that. It takes time to, I would say, buy the support of some countries in which people are still reluctant to recognize the emergency and the danger, the level of danger, etc. It's a negotiation. Negotiations take time, that's all. So it's not about the who and how the who has been conceived, how much money the who has, or what are its means, etc. It's not even about the power it can have. And of course, if it had a police force, but it should ask for to go to go and inspect, for example, Hubei. Can you imagine that they would be in China able to accept the surprise visits of a team of policemen coming from Geneva with who here and there, saying you can go wherever you want? No, that has to be organized. So I don't think that this is a big problem. The problem is for the countries to accept the idea that in terms of health, there is absolutely no reservation. So whatever you can do with nuclear weapons, because a number of countries don't accept to be inspected on their nuclear weapon site, you could do this with health. And for example, in labs, you know that the WHO team was not able to visit the P4 high security lab, which works on this type of virus in Wuhan. That's
where a lot of the confusion and a lot of the speculation has
of course
surrounded.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Anyway, we're running out of time. I think we'd better wrap up the session. I don't know if you've got some closing words that you want to kind of just give before we end the session.
Well, I guess, you know, we are always talking about or speculating about reforming these international organizations in order to give them more power over the states which are their members, and delegate their powers at will when they want, and can retrieve these powers when they want, whenever they want, etc. But in the end, I mean, the situation in which we are, empower them, because crisis after crisis, first you have the critics. Well, you say, well, they're still there, and they don't actually address the issue properly, or they are not able to solve the issue, etc. But in the end, crisis after crisis, they get empowered. It's inevitable. So there is space for hope.
Well, hope is always good. Anyway, so we'll end it there.
Thank you so much, Stuart. Thank you.
So
Thank
yeah,
you all. Thank you
take
all.
care, everybody, and we'll be back same time on Monday.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.